Started. All right, everyone. Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn. We are really excited to be bringing a conversation titled Pumping the Brakes on Transportation Emissions, Success Stories from Colorado and Minnesota. My name is Danny Robles. I'm the Climate Policy Director with Illinois Environmental Council, and I will be your host today. And we have a really exciting conversation happening in just a minute. Do want to talk through a few of the community agreement items. If folks can please keep yourselves on mute while the speakers are talking. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. But if you do have a question that's starting to trickle up and you're thinking about it, feel free to drop it in the chat. Myself and my colleague Paloma will be keeping track of the chat throughout the conversation to make sure that any questions that are asked throughout the presentation, we bring them up during the question and answer portion of it. And we also just ask everyone to stay, just stay civil during the conversation. Let's try to keep things to the direction of where we're going and why this is an important conversation. So let's just keep that in mind. I would like to talk a little bit about why we're doing this conversation. And then a little bit of it is grounded in the work that we do here at IEC, the Illinois Environmental Council. We work to safeguard Illinois, our people, our plants, animals, and the natural systems in which all life depends by building power for people and the environment. And we represent over 100 environmental organizations operating in Illinois. We carry a mission to advance public policies that create healthy environment across Illinois through education, advocacy, and movement building. And over the last few years, we've built a larger representation around transportation sector, knowing that here in Illinois, the transportation sector is the highest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a large concern of what that's doing to our climate, but also what it's doing to our health. Here in Illinois, we are the crossroads of America. Do not let Indiana fool you. Those road signs don't do it justice, because here in Illinois, we have, we're the center of the Midwest for logistics, for rail, for so many different ways of integration to transportation, and we're seeing higher levels of greenhouse emissions, which include nitrous oxides and particle matter that have higher propensity to affect the health of our cardiovascular and respiratory systems. And we are looking to advance policies that help minimize that. And today we're excited to present Lunch and Learn to talk about the success stories from other states like Colorado and Minnesota in the work that they've done to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in their states. So with us today, we have Miguel Moravec, who is a senior associate at the Rocky Mountain Institute and has been a lead research and in the work of greenhouse reduction. And with us as well, we have Sam Rockwell, who's executive director of Move Minnesota, and one of the lead advocates in passing greenhouse gas reduction targets up in Minnesota. So I'm gonna stop there and pass it over to my colleagues. So Miguel, standing over your way.
You bet. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. Can you see the slides all right? Perfect. Well, yes. We'll go ahead and get started. Thanks so much, Danny, for the warm introduction. Super excited to be here and talk about other models of climate smart state DOT planning. So if there's anything we'd like you to take away from today's presentation, it's this. There are tremendous safety, climate, and cost-saving benefits to expanding transportation options. In addition to that opportunity, there are existing models, policy frameworks that agencies can adopt to make sure they're prioritizing and maximizing these benefits. Up ahead over the next 30 or 40 minutes here, Sam and I are going to talk about the state of climate pollution from transportation right now, an innovative framework that Colorado adopted in 2021 to address this, and most recently, a big success coming out of Minnesota to also replicate the benefits of climate smart transportation planning. just to ground the conversation like Danny did, I want to point out that according to the US EPA, the #1 source of climate pollution in the United States is from transportation. It represents over a quarter of US emissions by economic sector. And most urgently, in addition to being the biggest sector of emissions, it's also one that might be increasing compared to business as usual due to investments from the bipartisan infrastructure law. This was covered in E&E News, and researchers over at the Rocky Mountain Institute where I work and the Georgetown Climate Center also found that the reason for this increase compared to business as usual may largely be due to increased and unchecked highway expansion, which, if left unchecked, can undo the positive benefits of all other clean transportation policies combined compared to business as usual. The reason is, essentially, the more highway expansion you have, the more you increase vehicle miles traveled. And like it or not, for the next several decades, we are going to continue to have many, many fossil fuel vehicles on the roadway. The vast majority of the vehicle stock will be fossil fuel vehicles. So, understanding this problem, we at RMI here, write reports and do research on which states are leading the way on making sure their state transportation investments are aligned with climate targets and not experiencing this runaway effect of increased emissions compared to business as usual. Colorado made headlines back in 2019 for approving a nation-leading model to make sure its investments were aligned with climate targets. The benefits of this policy are, as I mentioned earlier, tremendous. This is research not from an advocacy group or from the general public. This is from Colorado's State Department of Transportation. They commissioned a cost-benefit analysis and found that by aligning their transportation investments with climate targets, they're not only going to be able to reduce their emissions by 1.5 million metric tons by 2030, they're also going to save $40 billion for commuters over an array of different co-benefits, primarily from safety. Driving an automobile is kind of like baseball in that there's very good numbers and statistics on it. And the more you reduce the need to take automobile trips, the more you avoid collisions and highway fatalities and injuries, as driving a vehicle is the most dangerous mode of all of the transportation methods. In addition to safety benefits, there's reduced costs for commuters at the pump and at the dealership, and just lots of other societal benefits, from decreased air pollution to improved congestion and health outcomes from physical activity. So a lot of benefits, again, coming from the state cost benefit analysis of this policy. So let's go ahead and take a step back and find out what Colorado did to get here, to get to climate-aligned investments and all these other benefits for commuters. Back in 2019, the state of Colorado set a goal to have declining statewide greenhouse gas emissions. So this was not sector specific. This was just, hey, we, the state of Colorado, want to be carbon neutral by 2050. Okay. Well, the governor said we need to illustrate a few more steps. We need to really articulate how we're going to get there. So he released this greenhouse gas roadmap, expressing support for a number of policies, including aligning investments in the transportation sector with greenhouse gas targets. And this was very important to have the governor's support in this regard. Now, the governor was looking at issuing executive orders on this, but the legislature said, hey, we want to make sure that this greenhouse gas accounting policy in our roadways and transportation system is as strong and long-lasting as possible. We want to pass legislation that can't just be overturned like a governor's executive order every time the administration changes, but rather is going to be codified and binding. So they introduced and passed into law this bill, Senate Bill 21260. So two of the most important sections from that bill are Section 30 and Section 51. So the first section, Section 30, required that state planning meet greenhouse gas emission targets. And it took a special interest in transportation capacity projects, aka highway expansion, because Colorado recognized, just as the Georgetown and RMI research did, that highway expansions are a very big lever on increasing VMT and therefore increasing climate pollution. So we set the target here in section 30. Colorado said we're going to make sure we're climate aligned in our investments, especially for highway expansion. And Colorado added a stick. Colorado added this section 51 saying, if you don't meet the targets, by the way, you won't have access to the same funding streams that other metropolitan areas do. And so there's a stick and incentive for the many different jurisdictions involved in planning and spending money to align the transportation system with climate targets. There are many incentives for them to comply. Okay, so we got wonky there. That was some of the meat of the Senate bill. We're happy to talk about that further too. But following the lawmaking process, ultimately, CDOT is the agency empowered to move forward on a rulemaking to implement all this. They get feedback from the community, from stakeholders, and it's during this time that they commission the cost-benefit analysis showing all these savings for commuters in Colorado. Great. So we are now at 2021. This policy is implemented fully, and some of the initial results were eye-popping. They had moved over $1 billion away from highway expansion projects and into clean transportation modes. It's projected to reduce vehicle miles traveled by 70 million miles per year, which is the equivalent of taking off 5,600 cars and other light-duty vehicles off the road. Wow, that's a lot. That's a lot of big accomplishments for this framework. So how does it actually get accomplished? Well, to get into the nitty-gritty of what the state agency does, the first thing they do is they look at the large metropolitan areas, the MPOs, and say, hey, if we're going to be climate aligned, we need your community, your region to hit this level of reduction by this year. So Dr. Cog at the top is the Denver metropolitan area. They're given specific reduction targets. And you'll notice, Colorado has a lot of rural areas. So does Illinois. Some of these rural metropolitan areas were given a break, given a freebie for the 2025 target to let them catch up, hire the staff needed, and develop a functional and actionable plan to reduce emissions. So this targeting is very granular and is at the city and regional scale. After these targets are set, policymakers and metropolitan areas are given options to reduce the emissions from their transportation plans. So to close the gap, a metropolitan area and the state DOT might invest in more transit, might invest in land use reform that is proven to reduce vehicle miles traveled and make trips just more convenient and accessible for everyone. There's a long laundry list of mitigation options available to state decision makers to offset any emissions that are not aligned with the target. Going line by line and seeing some of what Colorado actually did to hit their climate targets, you can see that 80% of how they closed the gap was just by shifting investments into cleaner modes of transportation. That means 5 new bus rapid transit corridors in Colorado. That meant almost $1 billion of new transit, bike, and walking networks for Coloradans to reduce the need to be in a vehicle. And then the remaining 20% was done by making assumptions and changes in the plan for, let's say, land use density, parking requirements, and so on. So a really exciting slide showing just that it is possible to achieve these climate targets by making program level changes. Something that can't be left unsaid too is that equity was an important part of how CDOT approached this process. There'll be advocates that tell you they didn't go far enough, but there is language in this rulemaking in Colorado that prioritizes the new investments for historically disadvantaged communities. Okay, so we've outlined the 4-step process that Colorado took to achieve this really significant climate planning framework for the transportation sector. First, it was essential that the state had a statewide climate goal. Next, you had to have the governor's support, and having the written governor's guide saying, hey, I want greenhouse gas accounting and transportation was really helpful to California advocates. And then they codified that goal in statute, making sure that the state agencies had a clear direction to pursue this initiative. And CDOT did a great job involving the community and considering stakeholder feedback to shift all those investments. So Sam from Move Minnesota is going to talk about where they were in the process at the beginning of this year and what the outcome was of their campaign to incorporate similar climate smart targets into Minnesota state planning. And Sam, I'm going to stop sharing so that you can advance at your own pace.
What I hope for my entire life, advance at my own pace.
It's all you.
Yeah. Where is my PDF here? We'll just do this. All right, can folks see the screen? Yes, all right.
Yes.
So here in Minnesota, we pulled a lot of knowledge from Colorado. We worked to develop a kind of similar policy that in some ways was just different from Colorado's. In some ways was a little bit less comprehensive. In some ways was took several steps kind of forward from where Colorado started. So I'm going to walk through what exactly that policy was here in Minnesota, and that was passed this legislative session. But before that, talk a little bit about kind of how we set the stage. So we set the stage for this work over many, many years. Back in 2013, so Minnesota, obviously is also a Midwestern state, more of a swing state than Illinois in terms of our state legislature. And so we last had a full Democratic state legislature in 2013. And at that point, there was a big push to have comprehensive transit funding passed at the legislature. And that, for a variety of reasons, which I won't go into right now, failed. And so kind of coming out of that failure, a big group of organizations pulled together to work on trying to get significant funding for transit passed. This group is kind of a combination of folks who pulled together back then and folks who then got engaged all the way through this year. So a lot of coalition members. Along with kind of building a coalition over the years focused on sustainable transportation, we also had a variety of wins on the policy front and the political front. So we, back in 2007, actually under a Republican governor, Tim Pawlenty, established the Next Generation Energy Act, which was updated this year. You see the updates here, which established greenhouse gas reduction targets for the state of Minnesota. Then in 2022, the governor of Minnesota both established a climate action framework, which suggested a reduction in vehicle miles traveled as a policy of the governor's office. And then the State Department of Transportation issued a vehicle miles traveled reduction policy in one of their official documents, a 20-year planning document, which you see referenced here, the statewide multimodal transportation plan. Also in that plan, the State Department of Transportation plan was a refinement of the state emission reduction goals for the transportation sector. And so they created 5-year benchmarks, both for vehicle miles traveled reduction and for greenhouse gas reduction between now and 2040. In the lead up to this legislative session, this last legislative session, we had a split legislature and a Democratic governor, and we were not assuming a flip of the legislature. Move Minnesota and some of our coalition partners got a poll together with Data for Progress to understand where folks were in terms of their attitudes about highway capacity and vehicle miles traveled reduction. one of the things which we asked about was whether folks in Minnesota, this is a statewide poll, urban, rural, suburban, across a lot of demographics, would support a bill, hypothetical bill, to move money, federal and state money, from highway capacity expansion to multimodal options. And a significant majority of folks, 66% of respondents across almost every demographic breakdown, did support that. So we were doing this in preparation for kind of a culture change, narrative change campaign. And then in November, the election happened, and we realized we're going to need to use the information we gathered here to try to make actual change. So early on in our legislative session was Transit Equity Day. Transit Equity Day celebrates Rosa Parks's birthday. And at Transit Equity Day, we had informational hearings. We were able to get informational hearings pulled together in both the House and the Senate on the importance of transportation and transit to equity and to our communities. And although these were just informational hearings, we worked really hard to organize strong turnouts to really set the stage early in the legislative session that these were important issues. People expected action from the legislature, and it really helped set the tone for this as a session of action. We also had started talking with Miguel and RMI a little bit before that. At the end of 2022, got to know RMI through a connection built on some policy comments we had submitted, and reached out to RMI and asked if they wanted to come out and provide some context of what was happening around the country, in particular in Colorado. We had a bill that we were pursuing in addition to transit funding that would have moved some money from the highway expansion line item over to transit, biking, and walking. So kind of vehicle miles traveled related bill. So Miguel came, you can see him in this picture over here, if you can see my mouth, it's moving, came out and provided some information, education to the legislature, both to the House and the Senate, met some legislators, provided some context for what was happening in Colorado. We then, because he was in town for a day, kind of dragged him around to a couple meetings, because that's where we were going, and opportunity to meet some legislators. And we ended up having a conversation with a few folks who got really interested in the work that Colorado was doing. And we latched onto that opportunity to build on that, build momentum, and start moving on drafting a policy. And I'll talk a little bit about what that policy is in a little bit. In addition, oh, here's Miguel testifying. Thanks for coming out, Miguel. It really changed the tide on this. We also lucked out in that the state legislature moved very quickly on a 100% clean energy bill. And so they passed a bill to require a clean energy grid by 2040, like in the first month of the session. It was a priority of the majority leader of the House. And so they moved very quickly on that. And there was a big coalition pulled together for that. We were kind of a peripheral part of that coalition. And when that passed, a lot of those folks had been planning to work on the 100% campaign bill for the full session, and we're looking for something to do. We had enough kind of pieces pulled together for our work that we partially they offered and partially we convinced them to join our work to pass a transit sales tax, and then kind of by extension work on some of this greenhouse gas policy with us. So once we got going on the greenhouse gas policy, we started getting some pushback. There was a kind of a long negotiation period as we were hashing out different versions of the bill. Got some pushback from some of the building trades who were worried about putting a stop to highway capacity, but we were able to build a coalition that reflected a really broad base of support, including labor, including national organizations, local climate organizations, environmental justice groups, youth groups, faith groups, and more, and created a real counterbalance to any of that pushback. And we were able to secure support for the bill. And if there are questions in the Q&A, we can talk a little bit more about the kind of the political process there. But for now, what is in the bill, not a bill anymore, I'm used to saying bill, now what's in the law. So the laws are that I'm talking about here really address induced demand. This idea of induced demand is that when we get congestion on our roads, too often our fix is to expand the road. When you expand the road, it becomes easier to drive. Because it's easier to drive, people start driving more and start being willing to live further away, because you can live further away and theoretically stay in the car the same amount of time. Then our land use patterns shift, and then we get congestion, and then we need to expand the highway again. So it's this sort of brutal cycle here. So our greenhouse gas reduction bill took kind of two different parts, our highway bill. One is focused on the highway side of this, right? We don't want to keep expanding highways. The other is focused on that land use shift that I talked about with induced demand. So on the highway side, our bill works as follows. First, it only applies to the trunk highways in the state of Minnesota. So for the first threshold question is, are we talking about a trunk highway? And the bill applies to capacity expansion projects or grade separation projects. Grade separation means like a new interchange, basically. So if it is a highway capacity expansion project, then we ask, then the law applies. If it's not a highway capacity expansion project or grade separation project, law doesn't apply. If it does apply, we ask, is it consistent with our greenhouse gas and VMT targets over a 20-year time period? Now, remember, we have benchmarks for every 5 years. So you've got to be able to show that the highway project will be reducing greenhouse gases and vehicle miles traveled over a 20-year period. If it is consistent, the project can move forward. If it's not consistent, you have three options. Option number one, cancel the project. Option number two is adjust the project so that it is consistent with greenhouse gas and vehicle miles traveled reduction targets. And option number three is to interlink the project into a smaller program of projects that is consistent. And that interlinking, there is an order of preference of what kinds of projects can be interlinked. So first, first there's a preference for projects that are within the same community. So the idea there is that if you are experiencing the harms of highway capacity expansion, you should also be able to be experiencing the benefits of the interlinking projects. Number two, if that's not possible, and the Department of Transportation or MPO has to show that it's not possible, then there's a preference for areas of persistent poverty or historically disadvantaged communities under the federal definitions there. And if that's not possible, they can interlink projects statewide. The kinds of projects that can be interlinked are listed in statute, and we really drew from Colorado's knowledge here, copied it and pasted their list, and then made some adjustments as we negotiated with the Department of Transportation. On the land use side, we require that land use in the Twin Cities metropolitan area, which is our largest land use, our largest MPO, that land use planning and ultimately all the way down to zoning in the 180 plus jurisdictions be consistent with vehicle miles traveled reduction targets. So this requires the Metropolitan Planning Organization to create a climate action plan to articulate how that climate action plan impacts vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas reduction, how that flows into land use. And then there is already a legal framework by which that MPO creates a 25-year plan, and that 25-year plan is required to be consistent then with all of the comprehensive plans and zoning codes. Or I should say the zoning codes and comprehensive plans are required to be consistent with that plan. So what's the impact? The impact here, similar to some slides Miguel showed on Colorado, are extraordinary. RMI, we continue to kind of do some education throughout the and some analysis throughout the session, did some analysis of hitting the VMT targets in Minnesota. And their analysis showed that if we are able to hit our VMT targets, which is 20% per capita reduction in VMT by 2050, that will result in about $91 billion in cumulative savings. So when Miguel sent this over, I was like, I cannot show this to anybody. That number is too absurd. That cannot be true. But in the details, you realize just a $500 savings per household on gas costs per year and maintenance costs results in $35 billion of cumulative savings by 2050. So it's this accumulation over the years, which creates an incredible economic impact. And then there are other economic impacts, again, as Miguel noted, from health, from kind of the cost differential between owning a car and being able to rely on public transit, biking, and walking. And what does this look like really on a day-to-day basis? Again, this is also a nice graphic from that study RMI did. This looks like it may look different in urban, suburban, and rural examples, but it's a combination of switching your trips, of having more accessibility to public transit, biking and walking options, to having some telecommuting. But, and this then gets to our other kind of banner policy this year, you can't switch your trip unless there is actually something to switch it to. And so we, in addition to pushing for this highway greenhouse gas reduction policy, worked on this transit funding policy and got a sales tax passed here in Minnesota that is driving about another $450+ million per year for our public transit system. So it's going to allow us both to balance the books. We've been running a deficit for a while, but also to get healthily in the black and expand the system and improve the service. And that's coming through an expansion of our bus rapid transit system, improved signal prioritization. We have a new transit ambassadors bill that passed this last legislative session, which is about creating a more kind of human services approach to social service intervention on the buses and trains and so forth. In addition, we had some other transportation wins, and those include things like e-bike subsidies, funding for electric vehicle charging networks, new rail funding, some inflation adjustments to the gas tax, land use reform, delivery fee that is kind of a broad funding mechanism, and Greater Minnesota transit funding. So the session as a whole, and in particular these transportation pieces, they've gotten a lot of recognition, which has been fun, including from this guy, who people in Illinois probably recognize. And so now where we are is on the greenhouse gas reduction front and vehicle miles traveled reduction front. Part of the statute that passed established a work group to figure out the actual implementation of this policy. How are we measuring VMT? How are we working this interlinking between projects? How's the funding flowing, and so on and so forth. So that's where we are now. As Miguel talked about at the end of the Colorado presentation, there's kind of this, this was RMI's kind of flow chart of how to move through from nothing to a fully baked policy here. And this is a side-by-side of Colorado and Minnesota, and I might kick it back to Miguel if you want to say anything on this, and I can move us to the last slide here.
Sure, and it's my understanding that there are advocates in Illinois who want to move on this legislatively. Illinois has a tremendous opportunity to reap some of the benefit of reducing vehicle miles traveled and expanding transportation options. We've been starting a preliminary analysis for the state of Illinois specifically, and some of the exciting data we've seen using Replica, which is like a very granular car trip data set, is that more than half of trips in downtown Chicago that are conducted by car are less than 5 miles in length and in duration. And there's a tremendous opportunity to penetrate those, to replace some of those car trips, even just at 1 in 5 car trips with an e-bike ride, or better and more frequent public transit investments. So we're really excited to look at Illinois and answer any questions you may have, sort of modeling this this 4-step process if that's something that Illinois wants to do. And I think the next slide is just our contact information. Is that right, Sam?
That's our next slide. Future work. Yeah, what is the path in Illinois here? And our content. I keep on not being able to advance there. Questions. That's who we are. I'm gonna stop sharing, and we can send it. Make sure that Danny sends our contact out. But I think we can open it up for Q&A. Unless Danny, you have any wrap up stuff here.
I think we can wait for the wrap up to stuff after we have an opportunity to ask some questions, because I think there was a couple of things that came in the chat that were pretty interesting. And Miguel, thank you for sharing some resources for folks. Yeah, we definitely have a lot to learn here in Illinois on the work that's being done out there, but there's also a lot of work being done here. I think a couple of things that came through chat. Chris Murphy talked about how public transit in the suburbs is pretty inadequate, thinking about the fact that most of the system assumes that people want to go downtown, and there's a desire to create a more of a streetcar component to it. And just talk through that, Chris, I do want to share some information on the plan of action for regional transit that is currently being developed here in Illinois, that we're going to be working through some of these learnings and utilizing similar tactics that were used in Colorado and Minnesota to expand on that. One question I do want to ask Sam, though, this was prompted by Alan Partridge. Interlinking sounds like buying carbon credits. How does it differ from that?
Yeah, the interlinked projects all have to be fully funded. And so we got in the way Colorado did this was they had this what Miguel described as a stick with their bill, which is that they created a set of emissions reduction targets for the transportation program as a whole, and then we're able to move money around to make towards like greater biking, walking, transit investments to kind of make that work in line with their greenhouse gas reduction policies. In Minnesota, we have constitutional restrictions on some of our funding sources, including the gas tax, and it can only be spent for, quote, highway purposes. And so we could not replicate that program level model. But we created this system of interlinking so that any capacity expansion project can't move forward unless you're basically building out a program starting from the project that then has to stick together, has to be fully funded, and it creates kind of a mini program. So I don't think we'll get into because of how it's written, kind of like the double counting issues of carbon credits. But there are certainly like some conceptual overlaps.
I want to just add to, building on what Sam said, that, you can't forget the option that if you can't find enough of these mitigation offsets, of these verifiable in-state benefits to your community, if you don't have enough of those, the project does not go forward.
Right.
So, it's not, you need to be verifiable in how these investments, in the state community are going to reduce VMT and emissions in other ways. And coming back to the comment about the streetcar, one of the mitigation options is to adopt complete street standards so that you have, better bike lanes, more protected walkways. And I don't see why streetcars couldn't be part of that conversation, for Illinois, to show, if you have safer streets, if you have more options, people will take those options, and then reduce the dependency on the automobile, and maybe just take one or two, less trips per week. The benefits add up even at that small scale in the short term. So a little different than carbon credits in that I like to think they're more verifiable because the investments are happening next door to you. And if you can't make the case that those investments are going to help, the highway expansion projects do not go forward.
Right. That's the thing that is true in both Minnesota and Colorado, is if you cannot make the case that you have that reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and in Minnesota, vehicle miles traveled, the investments don't move forward. So I think there's going to be a challenge in figuring out what the right tool is for measuring the VMT reduction impacts of a transit investment, for example. That's what the mitigation kind of work group is wrestling with right now. But I do think we, in talking to Colorado and learning from Colorado, they were very clear that they thought we needed to reference the vehicle miles traveled reduction target and wrap that into our policy, which Colorado wasn't able to do. And so I think that creates kind of a stopgap where one of the things we want to make sure we were closing the loop on is you can't sort of assume a higher level of electrification of the sector to get out of some of the requirements. We have that VMT reduction layered on top.
Perfect. Thank you. I think there's a couple more questions coming here in the chat. I think one that's pretty interesting is about reducing reliability of gas taxes to light vehicle mileage, weight, and statewide regional taxes. I think that's something that we do have to address, considering proliferation of electrification is eventually going to dwindle that set of funds. So Mark Berger asked that question. Wondering, Miguel or Sam, do y'all have any thoughts on that question?
I think we both do.
Yeah.
But I'll go first since you mentioned my name. Having these climate targets is nice, but as Sam mentioned, if you're not funding alternative transportation modes, it doesn't matter. Actually, a few states on the West Coast tried to do this about 10 years ago, and found that without the funding and the sticks, it was much more difficult to achieve these targets than the success Colorado has already had, and that I expect Minnesota will too. So yes, the gas tax is going to continue to decrease in terms of what kind of revenue it's pulling in for states as vehicles get more efficient, as vehicles electrify, and as folks have better options to move around. Some of how Minnesota addressed that was with a new delivery fee to raise revenue. Every time you make a purchase on Amazon, a 50-cent fee is applied for orders greater than $100 to help fund transportation. That was a contentious issue that I'll let Sam talk about more as the local resident. Minnesota joined the number of states that has tied their state gas tax to inflation. So you have increased revenue from that. And again, as Sam mentioned, the sales tax in the metropolitan Twin Cities area, that 100% goes to transit. There's also the sales tax for housing. Don't get me wrong there, Sam. But the sales tax is expected to completely avoid the fiscal cliff that Minnesota had been previously facing in its transit system. So there are many, many options for how to increase transportation revenue. I guarantee your Illinois transportation chairs are looking into it, and this is the opportunity to adopt those new frameworks in addition to planning for more efficient and climate-friendly modes. Sam, I know you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I won't add too much. I think that, yeah, we have this new delivery fee on Amazon and, whatever, deliveries to people's houses. And yeah, I think there's an interest in ratcheting that up, but we kind of got to establish this last time around. I think that the transit in particular system is now pretty well insulated from those gas tax issues. The transit system is funded from partially the sales tax, this new sales tax, and then its old sources of funding are, there's some from fares. And then we have something what we call motor vehicle sales tax, which is separate from the regular sales tax. Why, I don't know. But a motor vehicle sales tax, which sends several $100 million towards the transit system as well. And actually, in the near term, motor vehicle sales tax is going up with some of the EVs because they're expensive. And so that's kind of unimpacted by the declining gas tax revenues. I know that there's interest in the state of Minnesota from some folks, and that we actually did a pilot a number of years ago on a VMT tax, and there's all sorts of how do you measure it? Are there privacy issues around GPS in everybody's car and so on? So that gets us a little further afield from the immediate topic here, but it's certainly something that folks are wrestling with.
Definitely. I think the next question is kind of like keeping in light of this frame of thought on Michael Potter's as the understanding is that Minnesota did create new revenue streams for transportation, but I think we're wondering how that play out in Colorado. Was that also new revenue, or was that a result of new rules mandating how CDOT spends its money?
Well, yeah, let's be clear. The primary effect of the rule in Colorado was to shift existing investment, right? So there was over that $1 billion planned, already allocated and appropriated for highway expansion, and they took that and shifted it to the mitigation options that I mentioned. However, in that omnibus bill, which included the climate provisions, they also included new funding ideas, like a lot of what we just heard from Minnesota, delivery fees, and so on. So there was also the additional effort to address the gas tax shortfall. Some states are doing that by taxing EVs more. And we'd argue at RMI it's a really bad idea to disincentivize EV adoption when they are like less than 1% of the wear and tear on roads right now, A. And B, you generally want to help folks get into those vehicles because they're reducing all kinds of societal costs and burdens, in your community and state. So, short answer to the question: yes, they also paid attention to the gas tax shortfall and introduced new revenue-raising ideas that Minnesota was able to learn on and also innovate from.
Yeah, and I'll note that I noted this constitutional restriction on our funding, and so we really needed to make sure that we weren't sort of reducing mobility, but were reducing vehicle miles traveled, which is different. And so we also, like most places in the country, had kind of looming fiscal issues with our transit system. But although we have this constitutional restriction on gas tax and some of the motor vehicle sales tax dollars to be used exclusively for, as I said, the exact language is highway purposes, we are now in discussion with some folks about the fact that it looks like you're not going to be able to build a number of highway projects unless you are adequately funding enough other projects to bring a whole portfolio in line with greenhouse gas and vehicle miles traveled targets. And so there's an interest on the part of some folks, even within the agencies, to see that definition clarified to include interlinked projects, which would mean that we're sort of getting through this ban on using gas tax dollars and some of these sales tax dollars to fund motor vehicle sales tax dollars to fund transit, and are actually able to move some of those dollars over and do some fund moving as well. So I think there's kind of, in Colorado, it's mostly moving funds around with a little bit of fund increase, and in Minnesota, it's mostly fund increase, but we're also kind of leaning into trying to move some of those funds around and get around some of the constitutional provisions without actually having to go through a constitutional amendment process. We had talked about doing a constitutional amendment ballot initiative, and actually the last question was what the reason that we decided not to pursue that, which is that most of the constitutionally dedicated money is gas tax, and that is a declining resource, and we didn't want to spend our political capital on something that long-term wasn't hopefully going to be there.
Many of you know this. In Illinois, you have the fare box recovery ratio of 50%, which requires transit to be covered at a rate of 50% or more of its own fares. That's not in your constitution, and that's something that I think would be worth understanding. How that would relate to any efforts to increase funding for transit or set these climate targets, and that's something I've heard from other advocates in Illinois would be connected to this effort.
Definitely. I think that's something, if folks read through that part, plan of action for regional transit, the Chicago Metropolitan Agency Planning has put together, there's definitely conversations about reforming the fare box recovery ratio and things that we can discuss if folks are interested in doing more of this working coalition with us. I will drop my information in the chat in a little bit, but I do have a couple more questions. And this is kind of a two-parter question. I think y'all mentioned the politics around coalition building and how you dealt with opposition from labor and others. Just looking at the composition of coalition, looks very similar to what we're starting to develop here in Illinois. And we're wondering if y'all can share about how that coalition and opposition played out in Minnesota. And the second part of this question is, were there any particular messages that you found most effective when talking to legislators, especially those in suburban or rural areas that don't lend themselves to the high capacity transit conversations?
Yeah, I mean, so the coalition was pretty broad-based, and as I kind of indicated, a fair amount of that had been built up over the preceding decade with some kind of ebbing and flowing through the legislative sessions. But yeah, that was part of the process there. I think in terms of labor, there were a fair number of kind of the construction labor folks who came out against the capacity expansion bill, but we had built some strong ties with a couple of the more powerful labor unions, and they were really working hard to get this transit investment through. And so we were partnered on the 1 cent sales tax for transit because they were going to be building transit. And they were very close to the governor, and we were able to kind of get them to neutral. And the fact that they were neutral and didn't sign on to that letter that I showed there was really helpful. I think one of the things that we did, and we were sort of able to do it because it was kind of a chaotic session, because it was like so much stuff was moving in Minnesota because we hadn't had a Democratic majority across House, Senate, and governor for a while. And folks decided that they were just going to take advantage of it instead of try to play it safe for the next election cycle. We were able to keep this bill really quiet. I'll put you on the spot, Miguel. Miguel told the bill author a couple times, because he had been providing some education, like, you got to talk to the press about this. This is a cool thing. And the bill author, Larry Kraft, was like, no, like, we are not talking about this. This is like a dark horse candidate, man. We're just sneaking in here. We're going to get as much of this done before anybody notices. And so we really were deliberately keeping this quiet. Move Minnesota, where I work, this was one of our big initiatives. We didn't put a single tweet out about it, much less a blog post. Didn't talk about it. Like, tried to move as much as we could. We talked to our allies quietly and kind of got them ready to sign on and to voice support when we needed it. And so we did that kind of quiet behind the scenes talking. We presented this idea at some like confidential coalitions, in some confidential coalition spaces. So people were up to speed on it. People were able to weigh in on it, but it was a pretty small group who was really like doing the day-to-day work on it. And it, that was part of the strategy. So for better or for worse. And there was a second half of the question as well. What was the second half of the question?
Yes, the second question is, what messages did you find most effective in talking with legislators?
Climate. There just was a lot of momentum behind climate. And we were able to point to the fact that we had a greenhouse gas reduction target and say, there's no way we are able to do this unless you have a policy like this. You can't achieve these targets without having a policy like this. And that was it. I mean, we talked a lot about the kind of community benefits as well, right? I mean, there are like, people who live in the suburbs also want to be able to walk to a coffee shop, also want to be able to get on transit where they can. And so there was a way of talking about that as well. And, we did with some people bring up the idea of, if we get cars off the road, and people into other modes, those are cars off the road for you. I'm not sure that's actually a very reduces congestion for you. I'm not sure that's actually a very effective message. I think it really boiled down to people feeling like this was their moment, and there were a lot of climate bills that moved, and that was what convinced people.
I want to take a second just quickly to share that Colorado had the opposite experience. There was a very, very large and loud coalition effort to move this, and there was loud opposition. Unlike Minnesota, Colorado has an oil and gas industry, a larger one anyway. No offense to Minnesota, there's some, but Weld County in Colorado came out very opposed to this, climate target setting. Because of the oil and gas industry there. The Colorado real estate groups, a few of them came out in loud opposition to these policies. And it was much more of a battle. And that's okay. Colorado still built, the coalition groups between environmental justice advocates who are very much front and center in this, to your wonkier climate research groups, but also to transit folks. And that coalition was strong enough to persevere ultimately. I'll mention in terms of incorporating the rural counties, in Minnesota, they only chose to have Twin Cities have that sales tax, the Twin Cities metropolitan area, and the rural counties were exempt from that. And I thought that was, from my perspective as an outsider, I thought that was a fair trade, because rural folks, will just tend to need an automobile more. And will be, contributing to VMT going forward, and that's fine. That's just how it is living in the rural areas. So there are ways to bring everybody to the table. And Larry Kraft from Minnesota even created an advisory group, inviting in those road builders and some of the rural counties, saying you will be at the table as we implement this climate framework. So don't feel like you're being shut out. And that was, again, in my opinion as an outsider, that was a great move from Larry to make sure everybody had a seat and voice, and to kind of win over some of the opposition. So that's my short answer to, this can go both ways. You can do it quiet like Minnesota, or you can get a really big and loud coalition like Colorado and still see success either way.
We also limited the land use portion of this bill to the Twin Cities metropolitan area. And you talking, Miguel, reminds me of another thing we talked about a lot, which is that we were very explicit that our expectation here was that the primary places where VMT reduction would be happening were the places where alternative modes of transportation were possible. And one of the directives in the bill, which I didn't mention, but one of the directives in the bill is for MnDOT, our State Department of Transportation, to articulate by land use type what the VMT reduction responsibilities are. So they are going to be, and we knew they're already doing this actually, but they're going to be figuring out how that divides up. So it may be that people in, center cities in Minneapolis and St. Paul are expected to reduce VMT by 50%, and people in, like a truly rural area are, we're trying to find ways so that they can reduce VMT by 5%. So that's the deal. And yes, our greenhouse gas reduction policy is net zero by 2050. I don't know how that compares to Illinois. I'm looking at the chat.
We're working towards it, Sam.
We just got it. We were 80% by 2050 in April, and then in May we were net zero by 2050. So
we got our target for our power sector. We're working towards the transportation sector. Once again, Sam, Miguel, thank you so much for the presentation, the question or the answers to our questions. I think there was a lot of great thoughts shared today. If anyone has any additional thoughts, please feel free to send those my way. I will make sure to connect you all to Sam and Miguel and the work that they're doing. I'm going to answer one final question from Joseph. Since Illinois has a then trifecta, would it be more effective for the climate lobby to push for an omnibus or take wins they can get with smaller bills? Joseph, that's a great question. I think we're working on something right now with our partners here in Illinois Environmental Council. So if you're interested, please send me an email. If you have an organization that wants to get involved in this, let me know. We're working to build out a coalition to talk about public transit, to talk about greenhouse emissions, electrification of vehicles. So really excited to be developing this out through IEC. And as our great comms manager, Paloma, was signifying, today was just one of the lunch and learns this week. If you're up and about for tomorrow, we are doing another lunch and learn, but this time on the deep dive on clean buildings. So talking about electrification of our building sector, the real cost and savings for buildings. We are going to be joined by our friends from the Citizens Utility Board to talk about how to prepare for the building ordinance coming up here in Chicago and hopefully pushing that downstate. And once again, thank you all for supporting IEC and the great work that we're trying to do here with y'all. And we could not have do this without you guys. You guys are the power of our movement. Without you guys connecting to the legislators, we could not get things done. So please keep in contact. We're definitely, this is a first step in a long series of steps that we have to go. Just thinking about that chart that you all put together of where Colorado is, where Minnesota is. We're square one right now, but we're working towards there. Thank you, everyone, and hope y'all have a great rest of your afternoon.
Danny, thanks for having us. Really look forward to collaborating with IEC more. And thank you, everybody, for the awesome questions. Happy to continue the conversation offline.
Get up.